Welcome, everyone. Lovely, lovely to see you all. Welcome to the secret life of soil superheroes. I'm really excited to introduce you to our guest speaker this evening. But before I do, I just want to introduce your hosts for this evening. So that's me. I'm Vicky Gutteridge. I'm the founder of the Soil Squad CIC. The Soil Squad is a community composting organisation, and we're transforming food waste into living compost. And you'll understand why I use the word living as the talk goes on. And that's right here in St Albans. We're based in the UK. And we are just really passionate about learning all about soil alongside and with our local community. And tonight is a really perfect example of that. And then I really want to extend my really deep gratitude to my co-host. That's Fran Elliot. Fran's here. She's the founder of Start the Soil, based up in Sheffield. And Fran, over to you just to introduce yourself.
Oh, thanks, Vicky. So I'm Fran from Start with the Soil, and I'm really excited to be co-hosting this webinar with Vicky. So I collect food waste from 5 neighbours in Sheffield, and I use it to create living compost for my allotment. I share my journey with my successes and failures on Instagram and support others on my allotment site with their composting. So I got into soil health and stuff through the Mycelium Network and Sandra's soil restoration course I've stumbled upon on YouTube, and it helped me learn so much about soil health, and I implement lots of things from that course every day when I'm doing my composting. So I'm just really grateful to Sandra for her generosity in sharing her knowledge with others through her course and this webinar this evening.
Okay, so let's get started. We're about to step into the underground world of the most incredible unseen workforce on the planet, in my opinion. And who better to guide us through this hidden universe than Dr. Sandra Tuszynska? Sandra is an agricultural scientist. She loved worms from a child who specializes in soil microbiology, mycology, and ecology. And you'll absolutely see that she is such a passionate educator with a deep understanding of how soil microbes drive the health of the whole ecosystem. So Sandra has dedicated her whole career to researching and sharing the extraordinary ways that microbes enhance soil fertility and resilience and carbon sequestration. So tonight, Sandra is going to take us on the journey into the microscopic universe beneath our feet, revealing how, if we can work with nature, we can restore and protect our soils. So without further ado, a really warm welcome to you. Over to you, Sandra.
Hey guys, thank you so much for coming. It's so lovely to see you all. I can see the faces, and I know it's late, so I'm gonna try and keep you awake, and hopefully not too buzzing, so you can still go to sleep after the hour. But yeah, I'm gonna dive straight into it because time is tight, and you've already had a lovely introduction. Thank you so much, Vicky and Fran. It's lovely to see you guys again, and this is awesome. This is just fun to engage. So thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to screen share, then we'll turn our cameras off, except for me, because you probably still want to see the face talking, and then we'll get into it. Can everyone see? Yep. Just let me know if something's not right. All right. So we're talking about the secret life of the soil superheroes, and I say that because I feel that those little creatures are the unseen superheroes of our world. And just because they're unseen, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't have a little voice speaking up for them. So this is what I do. I'm in love with all the creatures, great and small, and I'm particularly interested at the powers that they have in restoring ecosystems or making things possible for plants to grow. So basically, I run the soil restoration course, which is, I think it's going to be 50 lessons in total, but it's going to be an ongoing course that's going to be practical as well. And basically, it's all about the ecosystem and how everything works together to regenerate the earth from the ground up. So you're more than welcome to go on YouTube and find the soil restoration course. And there's also a website, soilrestorationcourse.com. And all the little creatures you see in the background there, those are the little superheroes that we'll be talking about. So basically, the whole talk is almost like a 1-hour intro to the soil restoration course. Every creature we're going to be talking about deserves its own platform. So there's several lessons on all these creatures. So you're just getting a snapshot of how intricately designed the ecosystem is and how it functions and how it all works together to make sure that plants grow and we are fed and we have a breath that we can take in every second. So the soil ecosystem, you can also call it the poop loop, because it all depends on how everyone eats each other, how everyone feeds and lives, and how that actually creates the waste. And the waste is really what feeds the plants. So it endearingly has been termed the poop loop. And in that poop loop, we have the plant, which is the main superhero. And then we have all of the associated beneficial microbes like bacteria and fungi and protozoa and nematodes. So each of those guys we'll be talking about. And then we'll look at how we can work with these soil superheroes. And at the end, I've got this cool slide showing us how essential it is to connect the soil and the gut microbiome, and that how scientifically it's been proven that when we're in touch with soil and the poop loop, we end up actually having a good microbial biodiversity in our own gut. So why would we even care for and learn about soil? Soil is an ecosystem. It's a living thing. And during the Dust Bowl in the Great Depression in the US, the president then, Franklin Roosevelt, said that a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself, because basically the Great Depression happened because the soil ecosystem failed because people abused it so much. The most important thing is that it cycles nutrients. So we get our food from soil via the creatures that we'll be talking about. And it also provides oxygen, because without photosynthesis, without plants, we can't breathe. And of course, it's the home of all of the biodiversity of the earth. And it is food and shelter for millions and millions of organisms and so many different species that we're not even aware of. It is also the largest carbon pool. So more than 2/3 of carbon are actually stored in soil. So we talk about carbon being in our atmosphere, but it should be in the soil. So that's what this whole thing is about, getting that carbon back in through the soil life. Soil also holds 3 times more carbon in the atmosphere and 4 times more than the actual vegetation of the world combined. And to me, I just get really fascinated thinking in those terms, because then it changes everything in how we freak out about carbon. But really, if we know where it belongs, we wouldn't be freaking out about it so much. We could just put it back there. So in the picture on the right, you can see what it looks like, what an ecosystem in the soil looks like in a picturesque way. So you've got a root system and you've got all the creatures, and in the little nooks and crannies is where that structure is present. We have creatures living in there. And then, of course, in the tiniest of nooks and crannies, we have the microbial life where the bacteria and fungi reside. So it's just a lovely image to show how it all functions together. In the gram of soil, if you look at the image on the left, just 1 gram, so about a teaspoon of soil, can contain 200 meters of fungal hyphae. And we'll talk about what those are, but they are fungal cells that are really, really thin and microscopic. So 200 meters of those, several thousand different taxa of all different kinds of creatures, and 1 billion bacterial cells. So that's just what's possible. And of course, it can be more or less than that, depending on the soil health. And on the right, once again, I wanted to show that extreme complexity of the soil ecosystem, where you got fungal hyphae, those white representations on the right here with like these threads running through the soil. There's mites, there are springtails, there are nematodes, there are microfungi, there's just everything there, and it is an absolute living ecosystem. Unfortunately, most of it has now pretty much been destroyed. I'm not laughing, but it feels funny to say that, it's all there, but it actually isn't. So because it's a living thing, I really believe that we shouldn't treat it like dirt. So these are the guys that we're going to talk about. So the plant is in the middle, because that's the provider through the sun and our outbreath, our carbon dioxide. The plant makes sure that it creates sugars for itself and puts that into its biomass to grow. But also underground, it actually shares those photosynthetic carbons or photosynthetic sugars with all the creatures that symbiotically live around its roots. So we have some protozoa type of creatures, so unicellular microorganisms that are not bacteria, but something that has more in it. So lots of different components. They're basically like a little almost animal. That's why they call protozoa, like primary life or primary animal. They're not animals, obviously, but they do behave like animals under the microscope, and they're super sweet. The little tiny dots in the background are bacteria, and so they are the smallest representative in this case. There's also viruses, but you can't see that with a light microscope. You would need much higher magnification. And then there's a fungal hypha. That's a fungal cell, and that's what it looks like under the microscope. And then we've got nematodes. So basically nematodes and protozoa feed on the bacteria and the fungi, releasing plant available nutrients. And this is what the poop loop is all about. So the poop loop basically means that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and also nitrogen is fixed as well. And so those gaseous components are in the atmosphere, and the plant has got this fascinating ability through photosynthesis. It can fix those gases and actually make them available to the below ground as well as to the plant itself, which we then consume and end up getting a benefit from. So all of the red arrows is what is being released basically back into the soil. So carbon and nitrogen go into the soil. The plant then releases sugars that bacteria and fungi feed from. And these two groups of organisms are your most nutrient-dense organisms on the planet. And so anything that will eat them will always require less nutrients. And as a result, it will poop them out. So it will poop out the excess, and that excess is always going to go back to the plant. And so every time we have creatures like protozoa or nematodes, which are the smallest microscopic predators, you could call them, they will actually feed on the bacteria and fungi. And the more biodiversity of bacteria and fungi we have, the more biodiversity of food we have for the plant, including all kinds of minerals, every mineral possible, as well as vitamins and other things. So once those organisms release that nutrient, and once they are eaten, once again, the microfauna, the larger nematodes and the macroarthropods, which are the little legged creatures, and the bigger legged creatures, as they feed on all these smaller creatures, that also gets released through the poop loop, and so on. The same story goes. So obviously our poo would have the least amount of nutrients, even though it's super nutritious, and we definitely should include it in the soil poop loop, as you'll learn later. So the superhero number one is our plant. And I love this image by Lisa Larson. I just find it so awesome. It's basically showing us exactly how the ecosystem works in a forest situation, in a garden situation, where we have sunlight and carbon dioxide, which is our waste, which is so symbiotic, where plants rely on our out-breath and we rely on plants for our in-breath. So we're very symbiotic with plants. And then there's carbon dioxide enters the plant, and through sunlight, there's a chemical reaction that happens, and the carbon dioxide is transformed into carbohydrates. And then that releases oxygen for our consumption, and water is actually released. So the fact that sometimes we live in dry climates is basically obviously due to the fact that there's lack of plants. So this transpiration process also occurs, which is the entrance of water into the atmosphere, which is very vital. So then the plant basically sends through gravity and other forces this fixed carbon, which is the carbohydrate, and then that goes into the soil ecosystem. And if the plants have symbiotic relationship with fungi on their roots, the fungi will love that sugar, they love that carbohydrate that the plants provided, but in exchange they actually feed the plant minerals from the soil, and that is what feeds the plant. So all these symbiotic partners on the roots, basically their role is to feed the plant the nutrients that the plant itself can't gain, and it relies on fungi and bacteria to transform that mineral content and give it to the plant. Some of this carbon gets bound in the soil, and we want that because we want soil structure. So all of this is just like a wonderful love story, really. And we have the drop of debris as well. So there's leaves and branches that fall to the ground, and also the decomposer fungi are the primary decomposers that are able to break this down and feed the soil ecosystem that way as well. So a lot of it is just cycling. So the nutrients that are taken up by the bacteria and fungi came from the plant initially, and then the symbiotic fungi take it back to the plant. So the plant is like self-feeding, self-sustaining via these partners that it has growing around the plant. So to look at this more intimately, there's this vital nutrient exchange that happens across the plant and microbial cells. So the plant provides the sugars, and the microbes provide all the minerals, all the elements that are in the soil, and the bigger phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, and all of those bigger components that the plant needs. As long as the food source is provided by one, the other one will respond to that. So a lovely symbiosis. And of course, that has many, many services for the plant. And that obviously is the nutrient cycling component. The carbon is sequestered, goes down, so that serves lots of roles in the soil ecosystem by feeding the organisms, but also by making the soil spongy. It creates like a sponge for water to be held, because it creates soil structure through all the microorganisms gluing the soil together. There's water infiltration as a result, and delivery and storage, and it's really good for drought resistance. But also, vitally, all the creatures that live on the roots basically provide immunity to the plant, because they live there, so they compete. But it's not really a competition. They already live there, so no one else can really come there. And inhibition as well. And the first superheroes after the plant we'll talk about are the bacteria, because they're the most intimately associated with the plant. And they work both by having the carbon photosynthetically driven into the soil and feeding them, but also the drop of leaves and stuff feeds these two groups of organisms. But let's look at the bacteria now. So they are prokaryotes. So they're basically, we could call simple, which is very difficult to say that they're simple because they're not, but they are simpler than other cells because they have no nucleus. There's no different organs or organelles inside of them that have membranes around them. So they're less complex, but super vital, and they drive pretty much everything we know. Like most of our bodies are bacterial cells, not human cells. So we totally, without even realizing, rely on these microscopic creatures. And they are some of the earliest life forms. So they're the ones that paved the way for ecosystems and for the world to function, because they do these amazing roles in the environments. And they are single-celled, so tiny, 1 micron, so 1/1,000,000th of a meter, large or small, and they're across all environments. And in fact, 70% of all the biodiversity of bacteria is actually in the Earth's crust, which is just like mind-boggling to think that the Earth is just like alive inside and out. It's all alive, basically. And a teaspoon of fertile soil can have from 100 million to 1 billion bacterial cells. That's equivalent to 1 ton or 2 cows per acre. So you can look at it as a livestock. You can look at it, instead of having cows, how do we regenerate the soil to a level where the bacteria are the livestock that are going to drive plant production. So they have an equivalent carbon content of all of the vegetation combined on Earth. And the nitrogen and phosphorus content is far greater than all of the vegetation combined on Earth. And that's because they are the most nutrient-rich organisms, because they're so directly, intimately in a relationship with the soil matrix. They require a lot of nutrients to make them into like little nutrient packets. That's basically what they are. So they're an indispensable nutrient source. And the majority of bacteria in soil are actually decomposers. So they used organic carbon, and that's the most common types of bacteria. But also there's photosynthetic bacteria like cyanobacteria, and they have different functions. But for our purposes, those are the guys we're going to be looking at. And it's really essential to remember that as long as there's oxygen in the soil and in the compost, you will have the beneficial types of bacteria. And when the anaerobic conditions start to kick in, that's where we sort of have organisms that are termed pathogens, but these are often organisms that are trying to decompose something, and they sort of take over because all the aerobic organisms are now removed. So it's very essential to have that oxygen and water balance within any soil or compost ecosystem to allow the proliferation of the bacteria that are beneficial for the plant. This little guy, the little green, beautiful little rods, that's called geobacter, and they dwell on rock and they coat iron oxide minerals because they actually want the iron. So they extract the iron, and so they're full of iron. And so, of course, if something eats them, that releases iron to the plant, and that's how it works. So bacteria on sand grains, so we've got little cocci, which are the round bacteria, and the rod-shaped bacteria. And you can see the glues that they produce to hold themselves onto the grain of sand, and these gluey substances that they contain and that they create in order to live on various surfaces produces soil microaggregates. So these are tiny little concretions of soil particles, little sand grains coming together, or little clumps of clay, and that creates the first sort of habitat, you could call, that the organisms can live in between, and creates homes and spaces for water to come through and for organisms to live between the spaces of microaggregates. So they also produce these gluey substances, actually have been a big hot topic in the agricultural sector because they have so many benefits to plants, and they termed extracellular polymeric substances, or EPS, and they've got a lot of benefits because they allow for adhesion, but they also have all kinds of other roles, these substances, like providing the means of the symbiotic relationship between bacteria and plants to be effective. They also create structure and a biofilm as a result, so the organisms can not only be stuck in it, but also communicate and exchange nutrients within that matrix. And they're a source of carbon, they're a source of genes that bacteria can pick up and have different superpowers as a result of that, because bacteria can actually take up genes into themselves from the soil matrix. They provide for antibiotic protection, chemical resistance and stuff like that. It protects the bacteria basically, and stress resistance. And yeah, they talk to each other and to different groups of other bacteria through these substances. The good thing about it is scientists are like, wow, if we've got these substances, we can add them and actually create more possibilities in the soil. I don't advocate like extracting this and making this and adding it as a substance. You just want the bacteria in the soil to do all that. But agriculture is using that to improve plant growth, basically. So rhizobacteria, but that's just bacteria that live in soil, it's just a term. This is quite cool. I love this. So you've got this bulk soil microbiome, and there's microbes in the soil like all around the roots. But then some of them, they want to be close to the plant. They want to be around the roots. So in the rhizosphere, around the roots, they're feeding on those sugars. They're not just feeding on and picking up excess nutrients that are there. They're actually like wanting stuff from the plant. They want to be fed by the plant. So they live around the root tip and they get fed those sugars. And then there's the endophytic microbes, and they're the ones that are much more intimately engaged with the plant, and the plant actually takes them up and they reside symbiotically within the plant. And interestingly, it is thought that before eukaryotic cells, or cells that have organs, like our cells, for example, that one of the ways that this cell came to being is through the mitochondria, which was once a bacterial cell that lives inside the cell. Basically, they are so exactly the same, bacteria within cells, that scientists are like, well, it must have been imbibed into a larger cell and they cooperate now to basically function. Our mitochondria that drives our energy systems in our cells are basically little bacteria. And that in itself is just really, really awesome. And chloroplasts are very much the same. They're the photosynthetic part of the plant. But there's very much this intimacy that can happen in the bulk soil, and it still serves a function for the plant, all the way to like these symbiotic, very, very intimate relationships. So rhizophagy is one of those really cool discoveries that happened actually originally in a Queensland university in Australia. And this is a root hair. So this is not a root, but it's the tiny little hairs that grow on roots. You know, they're almost microscopic. And inside those root hairs, there's these little patches of different sort of colors, and scientists were like, oh, they're just like little concretions of nutrients and stuff. What it turns out to be is bacteria living inside the root hair. But the plant has to obtain these microbes from soil. They don't just exist there. They basically enter. And so the plant itself engulfs these bacteria, and it sometimes consumes them and gets nutrients from them directly, or it cultivates them and they live inside the root hair. And that's what we call the endophytic bacteria living inside the plant. So, but these are actually endosymbiotic beneficial microbes. It's a really fascinating little story. They basically get pumped into the plant wants them in there, and then they cycle through, they get stripped off their nutrients, and then they get spat out through the root hair and with nutrients so they can form the cell covering again. And then they go back on the merry-go-round. They basically go back into the root and go through that same cycle. So the plant is literally stripping off nutrients from bacteria, feeding off of them. So it's like a bacterial feeder, which is just, yeah, it's a crazy discovery, and I just find it very endearing. So, but what these bacteria do as well in the plant, they produce growth hormones, plant growth promoting hormones. And so that means that you can add these bacteria like as a foliar spray or a soil drench or seed coating, and basically give all these superpowers to the plants. Like it increases potassium level, phenolic and flavonoid content, so flavors in the plants, and also that it's really good for our own microbiome having these, in the food. It increases germination rate and biomass and availability of all the nutrients to the plant, actually. And this is just so cool, because basically we know that if we have these bacteria in the soil, and of course now scientists are wanting to make it a product, but I always advocate make your own. Don't buy anything if you're a farmer. Just know that this happens, so you want to feed those microorganisms. It increases plant resistance to drought, salinity, heat, heavy metals, even diseases and pests, and growth and germination, which I've already mentioned. And they are not host specific. So that means that the bacteria don't care who they're going to feed, which plant they're going to provide all these superpowers to. As long as there's a good diversity, that is going to happen. So it's all about making sure that a biodiversity of microorganisms exists in your soil. They also provide nitrogen fixation superpowers. So basically, without bacteria in soil, nitrogen from the atmosphere cannot be converted to usable nitrogen for the plants, like nitrate and ammonium. So basically, what happens is that within the bacterial cell, within a nodule, which is a very, very specific environment for the bacteria to live in nitrogen fixing plants, that is the only way really that nitrogen can be accessible to us. So all our protein in our bodies, DNA, RNA, even the energy currency like ATP in our body, and vitamins and hormones are all produced, and they're only possible in our bodies because these bacteria make that conversion of dinitrogen. The gas has got 3 bonds, and to break those bonds requires immense amounts of energy. And this is why nitrogen fertilizers are super, super bad for the environment, because we have to put so much energy to break those bonds. But bacteria do it for free in the soil. So we're doing all this really hardcore, very energy expensive, very resource expensive conversion from nitrogen in the atmosphere to nitrogen in the soil. But the bacteria, if we just let them be there, they do it for us. And there's free living ones, so they don't need the plant even. They live in the soil. As long as we support their growth, they will do that conversion for us. And this nitrogen cycle is vital to the existence of every creature in the whole planet. So very, very essential to have these microbes in the soil. There are also other, and I won't go into this because this is quite complex, but there are other bacteria. They also solubilize phosphorus, sulfate, or sulfur and potassium. And these are very complex chemical reactions that go on as a result of bacteria being perfectly designed to carry out those reactions. But once again, we need that biodiversity for the bacteria to give those fertilizer nutrients to the plant. So we don't need fertilizers, because that's what all these organisms do for us. So our next little superhero is the fungi, and fungi are just like, I don't know, I love fungi. And once I discovered that they are so cool, I did my PhD on them, and they just have so many great functions because of this amazing concoction of enzymes that different fungi have and what they can do with them. And they also can be symbiotic, so they really love having relationships. We can call them, in this case, the mycorrhizal fungi or root symbiotic fungi. They form these relationships and they extend the root of plants, basically. So you've got a root here, and then the fungi basically extend, they grow within the root cells or between the root cells, and they extend the sponginess of the root's ability to absorb nutrients. So they are symbiotic root extensions of over 90% of plants, and they are thought to have been absolutely essential. So plants and these fungi colonized Earth together. The plant would not have been able to feed. So it's once again like a marriage that popped into existence on Earth. And you can't have one without the other, it seems. I don't think these things evolve because they wouldn't function otherwise. So it's just interesting to think about these concepts, because at the moment we're removing these fungi from the agricultural ecosystems, and we've become the fungal partner by feeding all these drugs to plants, But these guys, they exchange those nutrients for the plant. They increase the absorptive area of the root by like up to 1,000 times. And they provide faster photosynthetic growth, so they make sure carbon gets into the soil. because the fungi wants the sugars. The plant's like, yep, I'm giving them to you. You're giving me more food. Great, we can grow bigger now, So very good for yields. And the mycelium of 4 meters square of a perennial grassland can stretch around the equator. So that gives you the imaginative power to see like how much of those guys should be there. And we have almost zero. We don't have any in agricultural systems, because when we feed the plants synthetic phosphorus and sulfate and all of that stuff, the fungi are like, well, I'm no longer needed here. The plant won't even support them. And it basically breaks up the relationship, and the fungi just die out, or they just try to live on weeds and try to survive. So it's really crazy how much we're willing to put money into a system that naturally has been doing this feeding of plants for millions of years. And if you look at it like a plant that's sterile and doesn't have this amazing extension on its roots, there's only a few bacteria around, there's not much biodiversity. But once you have the fungi partnering up with the plant like it should, you've got like this already amazing ecosystem. The fungi are feeding sugars to all the microbes and asking for more sugars and other things from the plant. And it's a beautiful ecosystem that's already present around the root system as a result. They're called arbuscular because arbuscules are tiny little trees. It means basically tiny tree. And basically within the cell, between the cell wall and the membrane, these hyphae of the fungi, like a tiny little tree, deliver the nutrients right there in that spot, and then they get those sugars from the plant, and then they extend that out to the outside world in the soil. And this is the arbuscules when they have been stained with fluorescent dyes, so you can see them, you can identify whether you have some growing on your roots or not. And the other superpower of these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi is that they make this protein that Sarah Wright discovered in the 90s. And basically, they are very rich in carbon, and they persist in the soil for very long periods of time. And the fungi produce these gluey substances, and they excrete it, and that becomes the sponge for the soil. And it's just essential part of soil structure creation. And if you have these fungi, plants grow better. So if the fungi exist on their roots, the plant yields increase, the root systems are larger and better in absorbing nutrients, the yields of potatoes and other crops are larger. So that's the symbiotic partners. And then there are the decomposer fungi, so your saprotrophic, so basically decomposers growing in the soil. And I love this blue mushroom. When I saw it for the first time, I was yelling so loud. All these people came thinking something happened, but it was just my excitement over the blue entoloma, which lives in Queensland. But the reason why I've put it there, not just because it's pretty, but it's got a wonderful, wonderful function. And here actually it's growing on this giant piece of wood or tree. It was a fallen tree that it was decomposing over time. So it was decomposing this tree. It's mycelium, so the little thread-like structure of the fungi basically penetrates the wood and releases enzymes, decomposes these giant structures like wood lignin, and then it basically gets nutrients out of that wood. And then as the mycelium dies over time or something eats it, it releases those nutrients and other plants can grow as a result. So basically that's what all this is saying, but they really increase soil structure by chopping the wood down, basically making it into smaller bits. And the very fact that the mycelium grows throughout the wood and throughout the soil ecosystem, it just creates a lot of space and surface area in the soil. And of course, they provide great food for like nematodes and micro arthropods, so the little legged creatures, and earthworms. But that's the role of the decomposers. And I love this. Forest was pumping that day with lots of mycelium because it was so humid. And it's really rare to see this kind of explosion of mycelium on the ground in a forest unless the conditions are perfect. So I was lucky enough to capture this very abundant mycelial growth. And if you see here, this is actually a leaf and another leaf, and the fungi are actually stitching the leaf. So they actually hold the above ground ecosystem together. They stitch it because they want to consume the leaf, but they're holding onto it as well in order for them to sort of be able to grow forward. So it shows you like they function not just in feeding the ecosystem, but also how they hold things together so erosion can't happen in the soil. So fungi, absolutely essential in soil. And to show you just out of interest, like how much carbon they actually have and how they sequester that carbon, this is a brown hypha that I took a photo of under the microscope. The more brown, the more melanin it has, which then gets converted to fulvic and humic acids, which is part of the humus composition. But here in the image, you have the hyphae, and then you can see the labeled carbon or the sugars within those same hyphae. So basically, it shows you just how much sugar they have, and that sugar is the carbon that we want to suck out of the atmosphere and put it back in the ground. And the fungi are the most essential guys that have this superpower. So they basically transform and incorporate plant carbon and produce carbon byproducts and increase carbon retention in the soil. I'm obsessed with that structure, that feathery growth. So basically, to have a really, really good ecosystem, and this is just like a take-home message, because it is that ratio between the fungi and the bacteria that drives ecosystem succession, basically. And we can start at the bare rock, and that's where bacteria are really essential. They'll come up with the volcanic explosion, and as the soil is sort of churned, there'll be some bacteria that start colonizing. And that's how it all sort of happened from the beginnings of Earth. That colonization happens, but you've only got some bacteria. And once those bacteria die, other bacteria will feed. And maybe then if sun comes, you got a little bit of some sort of photosynthetic bacteria, and they start fixing carbon. And that's how the ball starts rolling. And eventually, when there's enough carbon being produced, fungi come along, fungal spores will land, and they will start colonizing, eating the carbon compounds. And then once that happens, you now start to get this ratio shift. So you might start with 0 bacteria, only 10 micrograms per gram of bacterial cells. And then, as you can see, in line with the carbon content being created, small plants start to grow. Initially, it's things like mosses, the bryophytes, which can't really grow really tall, but they're already the carbon source as well. So you've got these fungi starting to proliferate, and that ratio starts growing. And then if we've got a balance between fungi and bacterial biomass, you can now grow row crops, for example, like grasses will grow. But before that, you've just got weedy plants that grow fast. They don't need to do anything else other than reproduce and colonize. And they are like your builders of that soil ecosystem. That's why weeds are really, really actually good. I know we don't like them, but they have a fantastic role in the ecosystem. And if you use them well, you can actually speed up the recovery of your soil very rapidly. And of course, see how that also builds that soil layer? So you started from the bedrock, and once the ecosystem is thriving and the fungal biomass is greater than bacterial biomass by a lot, then you can support tree growth. So when we try to grow a tree in a paddock and the soil is at this ecological succession down here, you can see the tree's going to struggle. It needs that fungal biomass to provide food basically for the tree. And there needs to be sponginess for the roots to get through. And it's just lovely. If we understand it, we can do something with that. We can use that knowledge. And so to create beautiful soil structure, we obviously need the organic matter. And you can see in this beautiful aggregate, there's a lot of organic debris there. So obviously this person has allowed for a lot of the weedy stuff and all the biomass that was created to be left on the ground. And then you can see the mycelium going through all the feathery little webs. That's the mycelium going through. And they've basically divided the soil aggregate into different little zones. The porosphere is where the pores are, and for the roots to go through. So we want that structure. We basically want our soil to look like this. In a sandy situation where fungi are present, the fungal hyphae will actually hold. It will make soil aggregates, and you can see the hyphae sticking just sand together. So as long as you have the plants and the microbes there, and especially the fungi, they will start to create that soil structure even in a sandy soil. And of course, increasing organic matter will help. And this is a network of fungal hyphae holding particles of plant residues. So once again, hyphae going all throughout the soil, holding and hugging the soil aggregate. But there's also bacterial and fungal glues here. So these are the bacterial glues holding the bacteria onto the particles. So that's what it looks like when you zoom in on it. And these are fungal hyphae hugging microaggregates that bacteria are created into macroaggregates, so now bigger aggregates, that crumbly structure of soil that we want. And that hugging process occurs because these beautiful hyphae hug things and then they bring them closer to themselves because they want to extract the nutrients, and that creates lovely soil structure. And then when we have that, we've got space for air to go through, water. So very vital. And of course, if we compact the soil, there'll be more anaerobic conditions, less oxygen present, smaller pores, less water retention. We want structure, and fungi are the guys to do that. Our next little superhero team are the protozoans or protists, and they basically are anything that is not plant and is not an animal or a fungi. So they're a group of organisms, including kelp in the ocean, that have been basically lumped together because they're not a plant, they're not an animal, and they're not a fungus. So it's kind of a strange thing. So they vary from microscopic to kelp-sized large organisms. But basically the ones we're concerned with in the soil are the unicellular little motile, movable creatures, and we'll talk about them because they are some of the coolest organisms. So in the soil situation, the soil protists cycle nutrients just like all these organisms do, but because fungi and bacteria, unless they're eaten by something and the nutrients are released from them, they can be there, but are the nutrients going to the plants? If they just live, it's a slow process, the plant's just waiting and waiting, okay, and then once they die, there's still got to be something that opens up their cell walls to release the nutrients. So when we have predators in the ecosystem, or grazers, you can call them, they will graze on the bacteria and the fungi and release those nutrients. So phagotrophy is one of those ways. So that means that the amoeba or the ciliate basically engulfs another organism like a bacterium, digests it, and then spits out the contents or poos out the contents, making the poop loop happen. Some of them are symbiotic and then live in symbiosis with the plant or inside a nematode. Some of them are parasites in that case. It just depends, but they've got so many different roles. We're just discovering the beautiful, amazing world of this ecosystem that has protists in them and what they do. And this scientist from the Netherlands is like very, very vocal about these guys. So I recommend looking that up. But I'll just give you a short story of their wonderfulness and their superpowers. So these are flagellates. They've got this motile flagellum by which they move, and sometimes they've got multiple, but they are tiny little things. But their food source is bacteria that you can see here in the background. So they eat quite small bacteria. They probably eat some of the photosynthetic algae as well, which are also protists. But yeah, these are basically little hunters, and they'll go and chase bacteria. And when you're looking at that under the microscope, it's super fun to watch. And they can be a little bit flexible, so they can kind of stretch their bodies a little bit as they propel and stuff, but more or less they hold their shape. And then ciliates, these are honestly, to look at ciliates, when you do have a little bit of anaerobic sludge, like for example, if from a worm farm, if you look at the juice, it's just been stagnating there, it's not a really good thing to put on your plants, because when you look under the microscope, you see a lot of these little guys called ciliates, and they got these cilia, these little lashes all around them, little hairs, but they are super fast and they are super fun to watch. So they will always exist somewhere in like little puddles or, where there's a little bit of nutrient but low oxygen conditions. So they're a great indicator of low oxygen conditions in the soil. And they're so cute. I just absolutely adore them. I do a microscopy count of all the organisms in the soil. You don't really want them, but when you see them, you're like, oh, you're so adorable. But yeah, they're just an indicator. So amoebae. Amoebae are so awesome. They are like... I don't know if you've ever seen an amoeba, what it is. It's like the blob. They extend their pseudopods, which are these parts of their bodies, basically, as they move parts of the cells. And they change shape. So they're like shapeshifters. They are super fun to watch. I've got a little video on my YouTube channel, on my personal one, and I've sped up an amoeba moving from its original, because it's quite slow, to like fast, and it is so much fun to watch. So basically, they eat all the other protozoa as well, if they're big enough. And in general, one protozoan consumes 10,000 bacterial cells per day. So you've got loads of bacteria being consumed, loads of nutrients being released. So that's the whole point. And then, of course, other creatures like nematodes and other organisms consume them. Some of them create shells, and the shells can be very elaborate and very beautiful. And it makes me wonder, how does a little microscopic creature create such beautiful artwork to live in? It constructs a villa like this one. That's not the color, obviously, of these guys, but they even use little diatom shells to adorn their own shells. So they use other protozoans that die and then basically put them on like a little, I don't know, case moth or something. They're just awesome. And yeah, these are little diatoms within the structure of the amoebal shell. And there's another one here, and look at that. It like, obviously it's using some minerals here to make that beautiful shell. So very, very cool. And some of them will eat microbes, but if there is no bacteria present for them to consume, they will engulf little algae, and instead of consuming them and eating them, they will use them as a photosynthetic food source. So the algae live inside and they'll photosynthesize and get food that way. So very cool. And that's called a mixotroph, where it's photosynthetic and predatory at the same time. And some of the most fascinating are like the plasmodial slime mold. So amoebae that mate and create this giant cell that you might see in your garden at times. And they are known to have spatial memory. The cells teach other cells where to go and can replicate that later in the later generation. So they have learnt behavior transfer. And these are just amoebae. Like, this blows me away. So scientists were trying to work out the Tokyo subway network, and they mapped one of the physarum because it loves to eat oat flakes, bacteria on the oat flakes. So they've put around Tokyo, this is the center of Tokyo, they put the physarum organism there, and then they mapped out the distances with oat flakes of all the other subway network, all the little cities around Tokyo itself, and how efficient that network is, and can the physarum actually work out what is the most efficient way. And over 26 hours, it worked out the entire network. So it replicated it. And at the same time, it troubleshot where there were areas, because they were trying to improve the system just to make it more efficient. And the physarum does that. And so years and years of engineering work, in 26 hours, the little creature can solve that labyrinth for us. And this would have been planned for, you can imagine how much money and labor would have gone into planning the system. So this is some of the uses of the soil superheroes for these sort of endeavors. And this is actually, now NASA decided to use physarum's growth pattern as well, and it created a 3D cosmic web model as a result. And the slime mold growth pattern has a specific algorithm that then can be used to map the cosmic web, because the structure is the same, because as above, so below, you've got that repetitive structures within the universe, the way it's constructed. So it's basically showing the dark matter distribution within the cosmos. Like, wow. And then just pretty pictures, guys. That's what they look like. They get together and they make these beautiful fruiting bodies. So they're not fungi, but they actually amoebae forming these beautiful, very small structures. And they have wonderful names as well, but I won't go into it because I've got no time. This one's just beautiful. And looks like artwork, doesn't it? It's so beautiful. This is wolf's milk. And this is dog's vomit. Does not look like vomit. And this is like a raspberry one, I think. So beautiful. Now, the other type of slime mold is the cellular slime mold. And this is a very interesting organism. So what they do is they basically start off feeding on bacteria. And then when food is getting scarce, one of them or a few of them will release this cyclic AMP hormone, and they start coming together. They're like, right, let's conglomerate. Let's get together because food is scarce. We need to move on and let's do it together. So they just live individually. They don't even know about each other, probably. I don't know. I don't know. But basically, they aggregate, they form this structure. It's called a slug, and it stands up. Then the slug wants to move, so it wants to go where the food is. Together, they'll figure out where there's food that they can eventually sporulate themselves into. And they start making these cells that are immune cells. So some of them will become like immune system for the entire organism, so bacteria doesn't attack it. And they basically trap the bacteria. And it's the same cells we have in our bodies. We have sentinel cells as well. So it's crazy. It's like our bodies are also composed of amoeboid-like cells. And we know that because our blood cells are like that as well when you look at them under the microscope. So these guys then move. They go through like various structural changes where a stalk is formed, and those beautiful pictures I just showed you, they basically the spore bodies, the sporulating bodies called a sorus. And basically then the spores get released in the right place, and then they germinate when the conditions become right, and the cycle of their feeding begins again. They separate and go feeding for themselves. And this is what it looks like when it's taken like a time lapse with real imagery. The funny thing is 80% of the cells go to become the spores. So they will die, obviously, but then they will sporulate. But 20% will form the stalk, so they don't get that benefit. And scientists are questioning, like, what is the choice? How does that happen? Why do some choose to not have their progeny released? And there's just fascinating body of research into that if you want to have a look at that. But this is a beautiful slug, and it's used as a model organism for biomedical studies because of these very similar systems, like immune system, for example, function and stuff. So Now, the last group of organisms, I know time is short, I'll just go through the nematodes quick. But nematodes are actually multicellular organisms. So this is our first creature, which is actually an animal. And 80% of all animals on Earth are actually nematodes. And they are unsegmented threadworms. And up until now, there's about 30,000 described species, but scientists reckon there's over 1 million, because they live in anywhere, every habitat, like tree canopies, deserts, Arctic ice even. They're amazing, and they're being magnificently studied. They've won 3 Nobel Prizes already based on biomedical and genetic studies using nematodes. Interestingly enough, we can only withstand as humans the gravity force, so the force it takes to overcome gravity to have a liftoff, of 4 or 5 Gs, which is counted as gravitational force. And the nematodes can survive 400,000 Gs. So they're basically saying that probably it's likely that if there's a big explosion and nematodes end up in space, they can populate other planets. And they also have detection levels of UV 100 times greater than human eye, and yet they don't have eyes. So what is happening there? Some of them can survive, like the wheat gold larvae nematode can survive 5 degrees Celsius, like in the fridge temperature, for 32 years. You open up the vial and the organism is alive. So they've got superpowers. In soil, there's root-feeding nematodes that everyone hates, and they only go out of balance because these other guys are not there. And basically we want them to feed on bacteria. Some feed on fungi, and they've got different mouth parts as to how they do that. There's predators and there's omnivores. And I'll just show you some pretty pictures of that. But they do cycle nutrients, so they increase phosphorus and nitrogen by quite a bit. And plant biomass increase when they're present in the soil. And they incorporate fungal bacterial biomass, so therefore into their bodies to make their skin, their cuticle, they retain a lot of carbon as well. This was a picture I took. I was very lucky watching a nematode poo. I just caught it like when I was taking a video, a microscopy video, and I was so excited because all this stuff we just talked about, that is it. The nematode has done the poop loop here. It's taken the bacteria and it's pooed it out, and all the nutrients and the debris of the bacteria that it digested comes out. Some of the bacteria will survive and go on. A lot of them will just be crushed, and that food is made available for a plant. And I think this is a predatory nematode, looking at its little tooth structure there. They've got beautiful mouths. This is a bacterial mouth part, looking at it head on. But they actually feed other organisms as well, like beetles, larvae, tardigrades. So, tardigrades are a whole lesson. We definitely need to make one for the soil restoration course. But all these other organisms feed on it as well, on the nematodes. And this is a fungal feeder, so it's got a little spear where it goes through the fungal cell wall to pierce it. And then there's root-feeding nematodes, and they've got a larger spear. And it turns out that fungal-feeding nematodes basically adapt to become a plant-feeding nematode because they're desperate and they've got no food. And then they can actually change their food preferences. If we have fungi, we protect the plants from being fed on upon nematodes. And the nematodes are, remember, just trying to survive because they're there for a purpose. So lovely way to deal with disease, just have more fungi. Well, sorry, disease, pests we call them, I suppose. Yeah. Now this is a lovely pearly whites shot of a predatory nematode. Look at its gorgeous little mouth with little scary teeth. And that's what it looks like in a sort of a side-on selfie. And this is one of the nematodes biting into another nematode that it predates on. And there's also fungi that eat nematodes. So mostly nematodes eat fungi, but sometimes fungi are so clever that they will try to get nutrients because they can't get nutrients. Like, for example, oyster mushrooms do this. If there's low nitrogen in the ecosystem, they can't get any food. They're like, right, we're going to make some changes. And basically they produce a hormone. The nematode gets trapped between the loops, within the loops, and then water is injected, a liquid in the hyphae is injected and restricts or constrains like a boa. It just tightens around the poor nematode, and then the hyphae will penetrate and eat the nematode basically. And this is a nematode filled with fungal hyphae. So very scary sci-fi stuff. Funnily enough, even though nematodes are normally the predators of amoebae, and the scientists were studying this, what the population size changes are, they've realized, we're getting more amoebae than nematodes. We're supposed to be getting more nematodes and no amoebae. So what happened was they found that this testate amoeba decided to hunt pack the nematodes. So they got together, they organized themselves, and they basically attached the nematode on one side and started eating it from, from the other. And in 12 hours, they totally disintegrated the nematode. So the experiment went the other way, basically. So strange things do happen. Mind you, this is in lab conditions, and I don't know how this works in the soil ecosystem. It all depends on nutrients, and yeah, very interesting. So our last group, I'm not going to really go into them. I just want to show you photos of the other creatures that then feed on the nematodes. And these are all the microscopic creatures. And now we're looking more like macroscopic, even though some arthropods are really, really tiny and you need a microscope like this little mite. Rarely studied, very essential. No one really knows much about them. Once again, this is a whole something to explore for all the youngsters out there, because these mites are so essential in the soil ecosystem. And they are so beautiful as well. And and then the other group that I love dearly, and they really love eating fungi, are the springtails. So look it up. Look up Chaos of Delight if you can see it on here. And Dimari, he takes the most beautiful photos of springtails. And earthworms, of course, we want them in our soil. They consume and cultivate and disseminate microbes. So last part, I know time is short. I'll take 5 minutes just to go into the soil restoration part, because we know all this stuff now, and we know that we can get soil that's really heavily tilled and is just dust or dirt, and we can put compost, and you guys love compost, so we can actually make that soil better. That looks almost like a natural untouched pasture. So this is what we want to see. And the best way to see what's happening in your soil is to look under the microscope. I do soil analyses where I count the different groups of organisms to tell people where their soil is at. So that's one great way. But to do it practically without a microscope, without even knowing what's there, we can do so much. At the moment, we basically cut out all the forest to graze cattle, pretty much. Australia is horrendous for that. Absolutely unnecessary, and yet you've got all this potential to regenerate the earth, basically. We could take all grazing land back to forest very easily, and one of the methods would be to grow plants. Originally, it would just be weeds, chop and drop, and build that ground cover. Just keep bringing it up. Just keep mulching, basically, mulching. And that builds organic matter as a result. And then to speed it up, add the microbes that we've just talked about. Some of these soils are depleted. They've only got bacteria in them. We need those predators. We need those grazers. So to do that, you can set up worm farms. I like the continuous flow through worm farm systems, because just the way we worm farm, we want basically that 60 centimeters of growth of fungal biomass to develop. And you want to give as much carbon to the system. I used to just feed my worms food scraps, but that's very bacterially dominated. There's not much carbon. So if you add leaf matter and if you add leaves and stuff, you actually get like millipedes in your system and stuff. So experiment with feeding your worms in a way that's biodiverse in the type of food that you give it. And I don't recommend plastic bins, because I've had a couple and they actually do eventually disintegrate, but you can make them nice and weld them, and you can just be experimental with the materials you use, even though I mostly use recycling stuff, like this particular bin with a council where they've given us bins and we did a whole workshop. The idea behind the continuous flow through worm farm is you've got a little door there, and the scraps and the worms live on top of where you can scratch out from the bottom your material as it matures. So as the worms live in the top 20, this biomass matures here as they convert the biomass to castings. And then you open the door and you rake out the ready-made compost, basically. And I love worm farms. I love worms because they do like a cold compost. They do the work for you. You don't have to work hard. They do it for you. And that's what I love about worms. And this is more like you can buy these units more commercially. I'm sure there's people making even smaller ones, but you can be innovative as long as you've got that 60 centimeters and something to remove the biomass from the bottom that's mature. That's all you need. And this is just an example of we can feed your worms. You guys probably know what not to feed your worms. But basically then you can apply it to the ecosystem, really like actually use it straight. Or you want to make a slurry, for example, and that's to cover your seeds if you're planting, because the microbes will coat the seed and help the seed to survive and grow. Or you can make an extract. And with worm farms, you don't get much of the biomass, but if you extract it and like basically push the microbes into water using a strainer bag, basically they dislodge and you can just end up with them in the water solution And it doesn't matter about the numbers because they're replicated, and you can spray it on like sick plants to protect the plants. And then you can also put it into a watering can, or commercially you can spray it out depending on your setup. My last slide, we're almost there. This is literally showing us how we've disconnected ourselves from the soil microbiome, from our own microbiome, our own poo, the way we basically don't want to look at it. We just flush it down the toilet and we have no connection with it. It doesn't go back in the soil. We're not repopulating our gut. So all of these things that used to happen, where people used to compost their poo and then put it in the ground, and then some of the beneficial microbes would come through back to your gut through your food that you ate. And that was completely natural. That's how animals live, right? But what we've done is we've sterilized everything. We have no direct contact. And yet the microbiome in the gut is so similar, and the ecosystem is so similar. It's warm and it's rich in carbon and nutrients, very similar. So lots of species basically that are in the ground also should be in our gut. And they make our like B12 and vitamin K, things that are difficult to get. And that large surface area of both of those ecosystems is also very important. And the fact that the microbes provide immunity for our body and the immunity for plants. So it's very similar. And all of the things we do, like chemical agriculture, mechanized agriculture, urbanization, removes that. So basically we're becoming sicker and sicker as a result. So I'm encouraging people to make your microbiome and use it and eat it. We need to be in touch with the ground and the microbes. This is it for me. If we have time for questions, let's do it. But basically, you can take a screenshot of this. If you want to watch the course, it's for free on YouTube. I basically live off donations, so I don't have an income other than if people want to give me some money, I'll survive. And if not, I'm going to have to look for a job, and then I can't do this anymore. So for me, it's like I'd love to give the gift. It's not very appreciated at the moment. I've got 800 subscribers, and pretty much Vicky and a couple of other people give me a couple of bucks a month to survive. So it's something I've got to work on within myself, but I just love this. And I feel like if I made people pay for it, like there would just be so little people having this information. But it's got to become more sustainable and not as depleting as it is at the moment. And I feel that's how soils are treated. They get depleted. They give and give and give. And then people take and take and take. We mine everything and we don't return. And so this ecosystem fails. And I hope the soil restoration course is not going to be one of those ecosystems. I've made a blunder, by the way. I've set it up in a sense of I haven't made it clear that this is my source of income. I'm actually part of a lovely organization called God's Way, and we're going to grow food in this way. And I'm very excited about it. So that will all be shared on this channel as well, on the soil restoration course. So my dream is to continue doing this, and instead of just talking about it, to actually do it, video it, and share it with the world. So that's where it's heading. I thank you so much for your time, guys, and I'll hand it over to Vicky to give me any questions that might come up.
Wow, Sandra, I don't even know where to start. That was a massive whistle-stop tour. It was just super impressive. Fran has been in the background too, collecting all the questions. We did have some that came in before, so we've got a list of those. Fran, I'll hand over to you because I know you've got this. You've got this all in order.
Thanks, Sandra. I absolutely loved that talk. Everyone in the chat has just been asking and commenting. So yeah, it was amazing. I particularly loved the bit about the gut microbiome and how it's so inherently linked to our health and the soil health as well. I think that's something I hadn't really heard much about. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. So one of the questions we had online before the talk, and actually has been brought up in the chat, is around like micro and nanoplastics within the soil and how that affects soil organisms. Have you done any research on that, or have you read other research on that topic, and what can we do about that? Because it's pretty prevalent.
It's honestly, when you look down the microscope, even like at your own compost, and soil, I see plastic. And I know it's a magnification of 400 times maximum, but it's very concerning. Like it's because it's there in such minute particles, very hard to break down. Microbes are awesome at breaking things down. That's how I learned about. That's how I chose microbiology, because of my degree was so in agricultural science. I was just seeing destruction, antibiotics, pesticides. I was just so overwhelmed with how much harm we're doing in food production. I was like, what? This is what food production is? Like, I couldn't believe it. And I was just like, what can we do to undo this? And fungi are fabulous at breaking down plastics. And if there's enough biodiversity, they won't just break it down to some even more nasty compound. They'll break it down back to its mineral components. And that's the beauty of having these organisms, because fungi have so many different enzymes. And if you think about it, plastic is made out of oil, and oil comes from trees originally. So it's not like it's not all adaptable, and organisms do adapt. And there's bacteria as well that break down plastic. But without these organisms and the more nanoplastics that come and other, like nasty things, those organisms can't survive. So it's really essential to deal with those things, but also know that unless we feed the ecosystem, we feed those microbes to support them, we won't be able to deal with it. So without organic matter constantly and plants growing en masse, like regrowing forests, like literally that's what I think has to happen, not only because moisture will be available. Remember, these creatures, I didn't mention this, most of them are aquatic organisms. They live in soil and they adapted to a bit of drought, but they need moisture to move by, and to reproduce and stuff. So it's about creating plant biomass to feed all those organisms so they can actually break down all the toxins. So the answers are there. We just don't recognize how much by our food choices we're creating a demand on the ecosystem where it would destroy the ecosystem. So if we all grew, and I'm not saying we all need to be farmers, if we supported our farmers to do these ways of farming, if we regrew forests on lands that are not sort of viable for food production in terms of plant biomass production for food, I would be converting every single grazed piece of land back into soil production system and graze microbes, basically. I would be literally just focusing, how do I get my livestock in the form of microbes in the soil? That is what is going to break down the plastics. It's possible still, but it is very concerning. The fact that it's in our bloodstream, it's in mother's breast milk, and it's a hormone disruptor. Like, what's going to happen to our reproductive capabilities when we're full of plastic? And, it's a scary, scary, scary scenario. And the only way to do it is to stop producing the plastic and stop loading the soil and all our bodies with this stuff, And there are ways, but we're just so like, oh yeah, whatever, I'll just keep buying it because it's there. And what can you do unless you've got your own food growing? So it is very, very challenging and very concerning, but it's a really good question. And yes, the microbes can do it, but we need to support them. We need to feed them and look after them. And there are lots of studies, but once again, people know that it's possible, but then they're trying to make money out of the breakdown process, But whereas we don't have to do that. We can go, like Vicky and I were talking about it the other day, you go and you create your own resilience within your community, and then all of the community learns, and you're not relying on some scientists and some guys that are going to make money out of it in the end, because everything needs money, but we don't need the money. We just need to have the heart change and understand the ecosystem and go, wow, okay, I'm going to support it now, and this is how I'm going to do it, and be innovative and be the leader in your community like you guys are. So yeah.
Almost mimicking the processes going on in the soil, I guess, sharing and collaboration. Yeah,
that's exactly right. Exactly. Yeah.
Next question. So we've got quite a technical one here. So is there a way to check for microarousal colonization in plant roots without an EPI fluorescent microscope?
Very good question. Someone who knows their microscopy. I have struggled, and the only other way to do it is, unfortunately, through the cooking and a KOH process where you got to like prepare it for hours and wait for days. Yeah, an EPI is not like, unless you've got some cash to put on an attachment on your microscope. I'm in the same boat. I'd love to be able to see it, and it's something I'm gonna have to figure out, because I'd love to be able to see that, but no, I don't think there is, because they're so obscured within all the cell membranes and stuff, and I don't know how to do it without staining. They use ink as well. I've seen people use this one study. I found that they were using ink as a coloring agent rather than, these toxic dyes that are quite heavy metal rich and stuff. So there are ways, but it's still a very big process. And I think you still need like KOH boiling that. It's dangerous. So there isn't. It's going to be some sort of a microscopy technique that's going to have to be developed. Yeah.
Thank you. Just Kate's put something in the chat now. Kate said, quick question, is bokashi good or bad for microbes?
Interesting. I just looked up bokashi a little bit because Vicky was telling me about that she's creating it. I think from what I understand, it's a fermentation process. So you're getting lots of microbes, but they all bacteria. So if you have an imbalance between bacteria and fungi in your soil, and you've only got bacteria to start with, and then you're adding more bacteria, it's good you're getting biodiversity, but you're missing out on the fungi, you know. So while I understand it's a way to dispose of things safely in a way, it's very much just a fermentation process, you know. So you're not getting that oxygen-rich environment, and you've got to just be careful not to make sure that your soil and your compost is always aerobic. And of course, in a bokashi system, you're doing it because you want the anaerobic process. So up to you, but I always go for if I want all the organisms present, I know they rely on oxygen. So I try not to do any fermentation of any kind. But if it means you're going to convert something, a waste product, that you want to do quick and still not throw it into landfill, go for it, you know. So it just depends on what you want to do. I go a bit nuts. My fridge is mostly half full with my compost before I feed it to the worms, because I don't want it to go off and go anaerobic and, you know, alcohol-y, you know how alcohol starts getting produced. So I don't sit and wait for my waste to go off. I put it in the fridge and then I give it to the worms, and then it goes fresh, and then the system develops. I might have to get another fridge one day. At the moment, I'm happy to share it with the worm food. But yeah, it's just, you know, it's just understanding that the oxygen is what fungi love. And that's what I sort of try to support the most, because fungi are the most depleted through the way we farm. We chop them basically, and we get rid of them basically. So fungi are missing, and they're the carbon sequesters, you know. So that's where I get if only we all just grew fungi, the world would become a better place. You know. And it would, it would. It's essential. But there's various ways of doing that, and you know, we're all coming up with our little systems at homes and how to do it.
Yeah. That kind of leads into a question from Heidi. Would spent mushroom compost provide a good fungal matter, so more of a carbon based? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And as long as you're feeding them, you know, you just got to give that organic matter, whether it's leaves or some other mulch added in. And diversity of the mulch and the food is important. So that's why, once I discovered that I should be feeding my worms not just food scraps but also the carbon, that's when you start becoming innovative. You start raking up things and just finding things or doing things in a different way, so you can give that carbon into the system as well. And that's what's going to feed your fungi.
Yeah. I'm just conscious of time, so I'll just ask quite a broad question. So if someone's keen to just start improving their soil, now they're in a situation where they're not sure their soil is any good, what one thing would you advise they start doing as a starting point, a really practical thing they could be doing?
Worm farming.
Okay.
The thing is, because it's so easy, and the worms do it for you, so it's simple. And yes, they can die if you do extreme things like leave them in the sun and stuff. But learning how to do a worm farm is the best thing, because then you can just take the castings and extract and add that to your soil, and just, you know, and of course always having that organic matter. That's the two things: the organic matter and the microbes from the worm castings. That's my opinion. But of course, you know, different people love different things, and I'm not saying any of it is any worse. I just think that's the easiest and simple for someone living at home. Closed bin or whatever, you create a little system for them, understand how it works, learn the process. There's a website, on my website, there's a free, we can give that in the description maybe of the video. I'll provide the links to where I've described it and how to make them and stuff. That's the simplest. If you've got kids at home, just teach them about the worms. They usually love the worms, and then the worms do it for you.
Oh, thank you. There's a few more questions we haven't managed to get through, so Vicky and I'll collate them. Maybe we can add them onto an email, and we can get everyone's questions answered that we've missed. Vicky, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sandra, the feedback we're getting is just incredible. Essentially, people saying you're inspirational. We've even got someone has already signed up to your YouTube channel and is going to follow you, from Juliet. So
cool.
Honestly,
awesome.
I mean, Sandra, what you're putting into the world is just enormously generous. And I know that you just feel driven to do this because you know that this is something, knowledge that needs to be shared for our future generations, right? For our children. You don't want to put that behind a financial barrier, because you really feel like this information needs to be accessed. And I was just really grateful to you, and that's why I decided I totally wholeheartedly agreed with you, and why I really did actually want to put a small donation towards your YouTube channel.
Thank you so much.
Well, I just want to highlight that like how crucial it is, because, you know, to get this information in the amount of energy that you have put in, how many hours is on that YouTube channel at the moment?
Over 40. I'm just at the last, struggled a bit because I've just moved, so I'm just doing the last sort of part of the actual, I think it's 50 maybe lessons. Yeah, and I'm going to redo some of them. I always want to improve things as well, so that's part of, like, you know, you do something and then over time you go, oh, I could have done better. I'm always making changes, so I'm always careful, and I always want to put more research in, so I've got ideas how to keep improving it and adding more nuggets of information so I don't have to work so many hours, you know. But it's been 2 years full time pretty much, if I add up the hours, probably more. Yeah, and I just decided to quit my job and do it, because otherwise you can't do it while you're working full time. So it's like either this or that. You got to sort of, you know, and this is my passion, so I'm just going to stick with it and see what happens. But it is a struggle, because we're not used to the gifting economy, you know. If I have charged for it, less people would watch it. And I don't like the idea that this information doesn't come from me. I use other people's work, scientific work, you know, and I collate it from other people's images online. So it's not even mine. For me, it's just my passion that I want to give, and I can't put a price on that. I've realized that actually any price that I've made originally for the course, it was like almost like a depreciation of the value anyway. And then also only a few people are willing to spend the money. But if you were to calculate it, it's a lot of work. And yes, we do still need to eat. And I don't grow my own food yet. I am going to, in this project we're doing at the moment with the God's Way organization. But until that happens, we still need to drive. And if I want to go to presentations, I've got to drive there, you know, and if people don't want to pay for it, I can't go. So it's great that internet is available and I can pay for it. But it's just, that's the realities of life at the moment, isn't it? But imagine if we're all fed, we were all breathing fresh air, we would have money to do really great things for the world. Like, you know, we were all nourished and not as stuck in a like rat race, you know, the world could be so beautiful because we would all be connected to our passions and give our little superpowers to the ecosystem we live in, you know. We all have our superpowers just like all of those creatures. So, and even better, way bigger superpowers. These are like micro superpowers. We have them on like mega scale, each individual person. So I think the world can be a wonderful place for all of us, you know, and the future generations. We've just got to, our mindsets are a little bit injured, you know, not a little bit, a lot. Yeah, we're quite injured, like just in the way that we've been raised and, you know, how society functions at the moment. So let's change it. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for all donations, whoever of you have put through. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, huge thank you. I'm really pleased that you came, whether you donated or you didn't. And if you did donate, that all goes straight to Sandra. So huge thank you. But like the Mycelium Network itself, you know, I really feel strength in numbers with everybody that's come today. And that sense that where mycelium feel an energy, they surge more in that direction. And I feel that's like with you and with everybody on this call, that you know where the energy is, you know where a good thing is. And I really hope that start with the soil squad, you and everyone on this call can just take what we've learned today and kind of multiply it, you know, in our own networks as well. And that's the idea of today, is just coming together as a community, learning together, you know, filling the chat as you have done so beautifully. What we're going to do is copy all of the chat and all of the lovely references. I will send out in an email to everybody who's attended. There's some really lovely things that people have referenced and organizations and exhibitions and things. So I'll get that out to everybody with links if I can. If anyone in the chat wants to put those links in that, you know, they want to give a shout out to something that they find would contribute to this conversation, please do that. But I recognize it's 9:32. Sandra, your sun has come up.
We made it.
You. Yeah. We met you in the dark, and we're very truly at night here. So Sandra, I'm going to give you the last word, but I do hugely want to say a massive thank you for donating your time and so generously sharing, like with such enthusiasm and love and passion. So thank you.
No, like it's absolute pleasure. I'm so glad there's people that want to listen. So for me, it's a gift that you guys want this, you know. Yeah, and I love it, you know, as you can tell. And unfortunately, it takes time, and it's hard to put it all into a tiny little. I couldn't like skip things, you know. And the more you want to talk about, there's so much more I could have shared. But this is why the course is there, where I've decided like this 1 hour can be made into 50 more, you know. So and that's why I've done it, and I just yeah, I love doing it, and I love the fact that you guys appreciate it and want to have it heard. So that's all that matters, and that's fantastic. That's a gift to me. So thank you so much for having me on board.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys.